right, well, thanks very much, Wilson, and thank all of you for coming on quite a rainy day. As Wilson said, I've done a fair bit of research on French exploration of different shores, Australia and the South Pacific, but today I'm going to talk about French exploration of its own backyard and the French countryside, particularly right around Paris. There's more countryside than there is Van Gogh in this talk, but we will get to Van Gogh at the end. So I'd like to spend a little time this morning talking about the development of landscape painting in 19th century France. And I want to think about it in three different ways. So first, I want to spend a few minutes talking about landscape painting as a consumer phenomenon, right? Landscape painting is reflecting the development of a bourgeois aesthetic and a bourgeois patterns of consumption. Then I want to spend the second half of this talk thinking about landscape painting as a response to social and economic change, right? Landscape painting as a response to the Industrial Revolution in France, and in particular, landscape painting as a way of thinking about labor and labor relations during the Industrial Revolution. So let me start with the most famous critics of 19th century France, the Goncourt brothers. So the Goncourt brothers were novelists, literary and artistic critics, and they kept an extraordinary journal for several decades through the middle of the 19th century. And on July 1st, 1856, they returned to Paris from a trip to the countryside. And in their journal entry for that day, they announced their relief at being back in the city. They have never been so happy to see dirty plaster, to see advertising posters falling off the wall. And they wrote, "Here," meaning Paris, "everything is by man and belongs to man, except an occasional sickly tree growing out of a crack in the asphalt. And these leprous house fronts appeal to me as nature has never done. The generations of our time are too civilized, too cold, too deeply enamored of the factitious and the artificial to be amused by the green of the earth and the blue of the sky. At this point, I shall make a strange confession. Looking at a canvas by a good landscape painter, I feel myself more in the country than when I am in the middle of a field or a wood." Now, the Goncourt brothers were tastemakers. They were influencers par excellence in this period. And what they're suggesting here is not that the countryside is a bad thing, but rather that they are too much city people to really inhabit it. Their tastes have been too formed by the city, and so for them, the countryside is best consumed in the form of art. And so what they suggest, I think, is that landscape in many ways is a product of, ironically, urbanization. So these rural landscapes, and the one you're looking at here is in the show. This is Jean-Francois Mille's landscape with a clock tower. These landscapes were essentially bourgeois cultural products. And so I want to say a few words here about the mid-19th century rise in the status of the landscape. And you can see this, the growing importance of landscape painting, particularly in the development of the salon. Now, the salon in the 19th century was an annual, state-run, juried exhibit. If you were trying to make it in the world of art, being selected for the salon, for exhibition in the salon, there was no way around it, right? This was the show you had to be in. And this is a photograph by an early French photographer, Gustave Le Gray, and this is a wall of the Salon of 1852. And you can see from Le Gray's painting what the Salon really valued. I don't have this on campus. You can see that the big canvases that would capture people's attention, they're huge for one thing, and they are all historical subjects, religious subjects, possibly some mythological subjects. They tend to be very highly finished paintings. They have very slick surfaces. And they are in what the 19th century regarded as noble genres, so paintings of battles, of historical events, and of biblical events. In contrast, the first plein air landscape the first landscape actually painted outside on the spot, that appeared in the Salon as a finished painting rather than as a sketch, was also in the Salon of 1852, and it was Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot's The Harbor at La Rochelle that you see right here. So this was in the Salon of 1852, and again, the first plein air landscape exhibited as a finished painting. Now, Corot, by 1852, was not a stranger to the Salon. He had exhibited before in the Salon, and his earlier Salon works fit the model rather better. So this is Corot's entry from the Salon of 1835. This is Hagar in the wilderness, and this is a biblical scene. The landscape is Italian. Biblical scenes happened in Italy in the 19th century. The landscape is Italian, and the landscape is really mostly, it is the setting for this biblical story of Hagar. This is Hagar, the lover of Abraham, abandoned, and then the angel on top coming to rescue them. So an Italian landscape that serves as a setting for a mythological or a Christian story. Now, the painters in the show we have today, and I hope some of you have seen it, but I'll be using a lot of the paintings from the show. So the painters of the Van Gogh show here in Colombia, like Daubigny, with whom we began, they promoted the plein air landscape, the landscape taken on the spot, as a sort of progressive, modern alternative to the Salon tradition, to the Beaux-Arts tradition of the Salon. But that doesn't explain why I would say these landscapes are bourgeois. So let's think for a few minutes about what makes these landscape paintings bourgeois. The first point I would make is that they're the product of a mid-19th century rediscovery of Dutch landscapes, of 17th century Dutch landscapes. And the key figure here is Georges Michel, who's represented by a couple of paintings in the show. So you have one down here to the left, Georges Michel's The Approaching Storm. Michel worked as a painting restorer at the Louvre, and he worked on 17th century Dutch paintings, and he introduced many of the techniques of Dutch landscape into France. So in particular, the lowered horizon, right? The lowered horizon that looks very much like the Riesdale that you have on the other side that is a 17th century Dutch landscape, bringing the horizon down, giving you lots of space for atmospheric effects, for clouds, for dramatic weather. And Dutch painting of the 17th century was itself a quintessentially bourgeois product. The 17th century in France, of course, was the age of Louis XIV, right? It was the peak of French royal absolutism, of the French monarchy. In contrast to the Dutch Republic, this tiny little state to the north, the Netherlands was a wealthy state that was able to challenge the power of Louis XIV on several occasions, and they did that without a king. So the works of the Dutch Republic, like Riesdale's here, represented to many 19th century French people a kind of bourgeois Dutch tradition that contrasted with the French academic tradition that was basically monarchical, right? Product of the French monarchy. So the Dutch reference brings it into this bourgeois cultural category. It's also worth noting that these are small paintings. So let's go back here. Corot's Hagar in the Wilderness is quite a big painting, but his plein air is a small landscape, right? 20 by 28 inches. And one of the things you'll notice about most of the landscapes in the show here, like for instance, this Gustave Doré, A Stream in the Forest of Fontainebleau. I'm sorry, I don't have the dimensions on this, but it's right in the next room. And it is not a big painting. These are small paintings. They are not really suitable for display in the salon. So if we go back to our image of the salon, right, they would be, right, these very small paintings at the bottom here. Right? They would, in many ways, get lost amid the big historical paintings. Doré's in particular, this would be a hopeless salon painting, right? If you can imagine it on the wall with these giant canvases, it's very dark. It would look like a tiny black square on the bottom of the wall. These are paintings that are suitable for your salon, right? Not the salon. They're meant to hang on the wall of your drawing room, of the drawing rooms in the salon of ordinary bourgeois consumers. And then finally, the last point I will make about the bourgeois nature of these pictures is that there's a certain prudery to these French landscapes of the mid-19th century. There is no nudity in any of these pictures. You can take your kids to the show with no worries whatsoever. There are no nymphs in these landscapes. These landscapes are completely drained of eroticism. In this period in French painting, eroticism pretty definitively moved to the Orient. Right? There's a world of Orientalist paintings, of harems, of the French colony in North Africa that are saturated with the erotic. These landscapes, in contrast, not at all. They are peaceful. There is no tension really certainly of any erotic kind at all. Now, one of the things the Impressionists do in the next generation is rediscover the potential of the landscape for eroticism, and that is why Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is only a year after the Doré landscape, was such a shock. It is in many ways the same setting, right? A forest glen, gently lit by sunlight coming through trees, more lit in this case. Yet in the Manet version, suddenly it's the setting for this mysterious, bizarre, and clearly erotic encounter. So we have landscape painting as this bourgeois genre, bourgeois consumption. These are paintings aimed to be hung on the walls of your house. So let me turn now to the idea that these landscapes are a response to the Industrial Revolution, that these landscapes are a way of thinking through the consequences of industrialization and of urbanization. It is no accident, first of all, that the status of landscape, that interest in landscape rises at the same time as industrialization is transforming Europe. These things go together. To quote one of the prominent critics of the era, John Ruskin, an English critic, in his book called Modern Painters from 1843, Ruskin wrote, "Our love of nature has been partly forced on us by mistakes in our social economy." In other words, nature, we need nature more than ever because of the errors we have made in industrial development. Now, you didn't have to be like Ruskin. Ruskin basically rejected industrialization, urbanization, saw it all as a big mistake. You didn't have to be that comprehensive. You didn't have to be Ruskin to feel nostalgia for the world that was disappearing, to feel a certain anxiety about the transformation of European society and of European cities. Because this mid-19th century period was the period of the transformation, in particular, of Paris. So the population of Paris doubled between 1830 and 1850, and then it doubled again by 1870. And the people who were coming into Paris, this was not natural development. These are not children born in Paris. Paris is a terribly unhealthy place to be a baby. These are peasants coming into the city, the countryside emptying into the city. So the population of Paris was roughly 750,000 in about 1830, and it was more than 2.7 million by the end of the century, which is, I should say, significantly larger than it is today. Right? The urban core is much smaller today than it was, about 2.2 million today. This is the period in which the city is pushing out past its old bounds, and it's the period in which the Second Empire, the French Second Empire, undertook to transform the capital city. So the map here on the right is a map of the new streets, the boulevards cut through the city of Paris from the 1850s to the 1880s. This is really the era in which Paris became the city we know today, a city of big boulevards that slice through the city, that leave you with these vistas, urban vistas, and that are lined with this sort of urban apartments. So this is a quintessentially urban Paris view. It's a department store on the ground floor, bourgeois apartments on the upper floors. The other image on the left, you're standing on the roof of the Paris Opera House, which is one of the monuments built in this urban transformation of Paris, and you're looking down towards one of these boulevards, and you can see these other big boulevards bisecting it. So this is a period, just to give you a few more numbers, from 1852 to 1870, 5 years, 24,000 new buildings built in the city of Paris, just 5 years, hundreds of miles of new streets, as I said, cut through old medieval neighborhoods, early modern neighborhoods, completely transforming the city. At the same time, as all of this is going on, mid-19th century landscapists turn their back on it totally. Mid-19th century landscapists want to show us countryside, unadulterated countryside. They want to show us pastoral. And this style is particularly associated with a group of landscape painters who are really well represented in the show, which is called the Barbizon School. And Barbizon was a village on the edge of the forest of Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau, the forest of Fontainebleau was still a forest in the 1850s, largely because it had been a royal hunting domain, so it had not been chopped down or developed. And it became a center of French artistic activity from really the 1830s through the end of the century. And the key point about Fontainebleau is that it's only about 30 miles south of the city. It's very close to Paris. It was, as one critic noted in mid-century, the branch office of Italy. If you couldn't get to Italy to study those landscapes, then you went to Fontainebleau, and you stayed in the village of Barbizon that was on the edge of the forest. And so the forest came to represent for the 19th century everything that the countryside was supposed to be, right? It was unspoiled beauty. It was the possibility of spiritual refreshment that you could enjoy by leaving the pavement of the city and going to the countryside. Barbizon and Fontainebleau benefited enormously from the expansion of regular art education in Paris, the creation of regular art schools, because art schools took their students to Fontainebleau to learn how to paint trees and how to paint rocks and how to paint water and clouds and things like that. So art students are going there regularly in the 1820s. Corot, with whom we began, Corot began painting in the village of Barbizon in 1829. Narcís Díaz de la Peña, this is one of the paintings from the show. Díaz de la Peña first started renting a cottage there in the 1840s. He was soon followed by Théodore Rousseau, who's not actually in that show. But Jules Dupré, who was a particular favorite of Van Gogh's. Dupré was a regular in Barbizon, again, renting mostly in the summer. And then Jean-Francois Mille A, probably the most famous of the Barbizon artists, Mille A moved permanently to Barbizon in 1849. Mille A had 9 children, and Barbizon was a lot cheaper also than living in central Paris. And the fact that he lived in the country was an important part of Mille A's brand, right? Mille A's publicist emphasized Mille A's peasant origins, which is not exactly true. He did not exactly come from a peasant family. The publicist emphasize Mille A's family values, right? The idea is that he's a peasant living among peasants, that he represents these really traditional, like salt of the earth, peasant values. And again, that is not exactly true. Mille A's biographer changed the date of his marriage in the biography because those 9 children I mentioned were none of them born in wedlock. Mille A and his mistress moved to Fontainebleau, and they actually got married 30 years after the biographer dated their marriage. So that Mille A and Catherine Lemaire were actually living in sort of bohemian Parisian artistic lifestyle in the forest of Barbizon, or in the forest of Fontainebleau, for many years. So by 1856, there were 6 artists permanently in residence in Barbizon, a whole handful more who rented during the summer. Daubigny was one of those, the guy we started with. Charles-Émile Jacques, who this is from the Columbia show. Jacques lived at Barbizon. He painted there. He also established an asparagus farm on some sandy soil that's sort of on the edge of the forest. And the whole point about Barbizon for these painters is not only that it's the branch office of Italy, it's not just that it's where you come to paint pastoral scenery, it's that you can stay in touch with the city there, right? The market for Jacques' asparagus is Paris, just as the market for Jacques' paintings is Paris. Théodore Rousseau kept a flat in Paris so that he could zip up and talk to his dealer regularly. Key moment in the history of Barbizon, the train line from Paris, direct train line Paris to Barbizon, opened in 1849. By the 1850s, Barbizon then was a tourist destination. So on the left, you have an 1837 book, 4 Walks in the Forest of Barbizon. And on the right is a page from a French illustrated weekly. This is from l'Illustration, and it shows you various painters' work. and where you go see that scene, right? You can admire the artist, then you can go see the scene itself. And this is actually also a useful reminder that many of the kinds of paintings that we're talking about, Van Gogh and others actually consumed in engraved form. It's as prints that they often saw these landscapes. And sometimes these were prints produced in the mass illustrated press. So, if you were going to Barbizon, you would take very likely one of the walks that Monsieur Jamin recommended. You would probably stop off at the old inn. There was an inn owned by one Monsieur Gunn, and you had to see Monsieur Gunn's inn because he had old cupboards that various artists had kind of sketched on the doors. So seeing the inn with the cupboards was part of the itinerary. And so there were well-trod tourist paths into Fontainebleau. And if you asked people in the know by the 1860s, they would tell you that Barbizon was totally spoiled by the 1860s. This is today, but Barbizon is still the village of painters. By the 1860s, the original inn, Monsieur Gunn's inn, he closed it down. He bought a more picturesque spot and built an all-modern hotel, the Artist's Hotel, that you could stay in much more comfortably. The Emperor Napoleon III and his Empress visited this village in 1868. And just to put the nail in the coffin, there was a museum. So you know it's not fresh and spontaneous anymore when there's a museum there. That museum, incidentally, recently moved into the building that was Monsieur Gunn's original inn in Barbizon. So even though people would tell you that that Barbizon was now a tourist trap, it was basically spoiled, but they were basically wrong. Because all along, the point of Barbizon was simultaneity, right? It was that you could be in the countryside without losing track of the city, right? The city did not vanish from your mind. It did not disappear from your consciousness. You were immersing yourself in the rural in the full knowledge that the city was there waiting for you, it was continuing on, and you were not cutting yourself off from it. So simultaneity is an important part of what viewers appreciated about these landscapes, that it was so close to the city and yet so far. So this Barbizon style is essentially pastoral. You see in the paintings, you see no hint of Barbizon as day tripper destination from Paris, which it was by the end of the century. There was a painting of a Barbizon landscape that appeared in the Salon of 1857 that one of the major critics condemned harshly because the painter had left a telegraph wire visible running through the landscape. And the critic wrote, what is there in common between this brass wire, this utilitarian industrial product, and landscape, which is the seeking and expression of beauty in nature? He concluded, it is nonsense, this painting. So it's a pastoral that denies, but that is also pretty conscious of the fact of existing simultaneously with urbanizing Paris. And it's worth noting that this is a real difference between the Barbizon generation and the Impressionists who would follow, who were fascinated by the telegraph wire running through the countryside, the train running through a rural landscape. They were fascinated by the interface between the rural and the urban on the edges of the city. This earlier mid-century Barbizon generation denies that completely. So, okay, landscape, industrialization, urbanization. Let's turn now to thinking about landscape and labor. Because Barbizon, the Barbizon pastoral, was also a location for working out 19th century ideas about industrial labor, about what work meant and who did it. And in this context, the most important of the Barbizon painters is Jean-Francois Mille A. And this is really his most important work about labor, The Gleaners. And it's worth noting, first of all, that Mille A pulls no punches here about work. Right? This is hard work. In fact, this is a painting about hardcore poverty. Gleaning, of course, is a traditional peasant right? Peasants can go through the fields and pick up the odd bits of wheat or other grain that have fallen during the harvest. You can see the harvest is going on in the background. The background is prosperous, right? There are giant bales of hay. There is our landowner on his horse supervising his harvest. But in the foreground, we have real poverty. We have women who are stooped, and they're not stooped to sort of pick up a handkerchief in a graceful way, right? Stooping is their natural posture. Even the woman who is more or less standing is still stooped, right? Mille pulls no punches about the fact that this is hard work and that these peasants are not simply picturesque, that they live difficult lives. But in addition to that, for Mille, and also for most of his critics, these peasants symbolized timeless virtues. Critics, as I've already suggested, often conflated Mille with his peasant subjects, right? So Mille as a peasant painter. Again, just to read you a passage from a critic writing about Mille, Edmond About described him as the farmer painter, half peasant, who lives deep in the woods with his large family. And About said that Mille disliked going to Paris because in Paris, he had to put on leather shoes instead of the wooden sabots, the wooden shoes that real peasants wore. And the point about Mille's representations of peasants and the way they were often represented in the critical journalism was that these are peasants whose labor has largely been kind of drained of political content, right? These are pretty depoliticized peasants and depoliticized labor. Gleaning is a good example of this. Gleaning was in fact a flashpoint for rural conflict at the middle of the 19th century, because gleaning was one of a whole series of what peasants considered rights. So peasants in the 1840s and 50s absolutely believed they had a right to glean, right? To go and pick up the grain that fell after the harvest. They had a right to pick up firewood. You couldn't cut trees down, but if wood had fallen, you could pick it up. They had a right in many places to tether a goat on the commons. They had a right to fish in certain waterways. They had a right to turn pigs out into the local nobleman's forest during the fall, and the pig would forage on acorns and such. And for peasants, these rights were often a kind of make or break. This is how peasants made ends meet, right? They had no animals if you couldn't turn out the pig in the forest or tether the goat on the commons. For landowners, however, these are archaic, backward, superstitious nonsense that are in total conflict with modern ideas about private property. Right? If this is my land, I do not have to let you turn your pig out on it. Private property was in the process of trumping traditional peasant rights in the middle of the 19th century, and practices like gleaning were the flashpoint for these kinds of disputes. No hint of that here. Again, the harvest goes on peacefully in the background. The peasant women bend eternally and pick up their grain. This is a painting about fatalism rather than about a very specific, temporally located conflict. So this timelessness of Mille's peasants really removes them from the real historical conflict of the mid-19th century. These peasants, effectively, they belong to eternity rather than to the 19th century. These peasants were, as one observer of Mille's painting said, locked into a caste that does not have the elasticity of other social classes. In other words, peasants are born peasants, they die peasants, their children are peasants. There is no elasticity to this. Crucially, what this means, they are not urban workers, right? They are not urban workers. There is a certain classlessness to them. And many of the paintings of labor that you'll see in this show share a similar sense of peasant classlessness, timelessness. Peasants that you really can't imagine engaging in any kind of collective action, right? They're not going to organize, they're not going to demand their rights, they're not going to unionize. So very often, this is Jacques of the Asparagus Farm. So very often their workers are solitary, right? They're not in a position to organize because they work by themselves, as our solitary shepherd. Similarly, L'Ermite's Bernays weaver. This is a great example because this world of weaving is dying. in fact, Béarn, the region L'Ermite is painting, is one of the last regions in France that's poor enough for this kind of economy to survive by the second half of the 19th century. So this is not a factory. This is a peasant with a loom in the house, and the peasant and his wife produce cloth. So this is the kind of world that is disappearing, but again, no sense of conflict, no sense of even a sort of particular time and place. Alternately, you find when you see peasants in groups, they're often in small family groups, or, as in Millet's paintings, there are a lot of women involved, which tends to sort of take the sting of possible industrial organization out of it. This is one of my favorites. Jules Breton is not in this show, but Jules Breton was one of the most prominent Barbizon landscapists. And so we have here the harvest at Chateau Lagrange. And this is a lovely painting of the grape harvest, right? The baskets of grapes are picturesque. They're not overly heavy. We have women and children as well. This doesn't look like they're ever going to turn into an angry crowd. Actually, it looks like they could be in an opera. They might break out singing any minute. And it's not a coincidence that the person who commissioned this painting from Jules Breton was, in fact, the owner of the Chateau Lagrange, right? This is his idea of what labor relations are supposed to be, right? This is what he wanted hanging in his headquarters. So in the context of the Industrial Revolution, in the context of a growing working class making increasing demands, forming unions, with socialism spreading in the second half of the 19th century, all of these peasants seem to many of our critics like model laborers, timeless rather than specific to the 19th century. And this is not the only painting purchased by management, as it were. Several of Millet's most important collectors in the mid-19th century were industrialists and railroad magnates. They knew what they were looking at, they knew what they wanted, and they appreciated Millet. So effectively, these landscapes, what I'm arguing, these are very conservative pictures, right? One art historian has even referred to these late Barbizon pictures as what he calls the covert official style of France's Second Empire. Now, France's Second Empire was in many ways democratic. It certainly promoted itself as democratic. There was universal manhood suffrage under the Second Empire. There were regular elections. They didn't actually mean very much, but everybody, or all men, voted on a pretty regular occasion in elections where nothing much was at stake. But nonetheless, everybody voted. The emperor, Napoleon III, so he's the nephew of the original Napoleon, Napoleon III presented himself as a man of the people. And these paintings, in many ways, they kind of air the plebeian concerns of the emperor, right? The idea that the emperor is a man of the people. There are a lot of common folk in these paintings. But ultimately, what these paintings do is they sort of distract attention from other kinds of people. And in particular, they distract attention away from social conflict, both urban social conflict, but also conflict in rural society. And so I promised that we would, in fact, get to Van Gogh, because Van Gogh certainly appreciated the peasants of these Barbizon landscapes. The idea that these peasants are kind of symbols of eternity, of a timeless labor. Van Gogh appreciated this. So again, here's another Millet, the sower, the kind of repetitive gesture over and over again throughout a lifetime, the same gesture his father, grandfather, and so on made, and the painting leads us to believe the same gesture that peasants will make forevermore. Van Gogh found that really appealing. And for Van Gogh, there's an additional layer here of his very strong and devout Protestantism, that he found these peasants as symbols of eternity particularly appealing, which is why Van Gogh copied Millet's sower over and over again. So here are two versions of Van Gogh reproducing Millet's sower. But what I think is so interesting about the Van Gogh is that we see Van Gogh who's finds Millet's conservative social vision really pretty appealing, and yet he takes that conservative social vision and turns it towards artistic radicalism, right, to a very aesthetic radicalism, not a social radicalism, but, a very aesthetic radicalism of color and the use of paint. And so with that, I will thank you all very much for your attention. I'd love to hear any questions you have, and I will hand it over to you.